we're going to talk about contestation, specifically how to harness contestation as windows of opportunity for transitions. Okay, so what does contestation mean, first of all? Contestation is the degree of normative divergence related to a policy issue resulting from divergent claims, values, framings, and conflicts of interest. And it's one of three constituents of wicked problems. So wicked problems are made up of contestation, complexity, and uncertainty. Why are we interested as a TIP community in contestation? Because socio-technical transitions are evolutionary, interpretive, and contested processes. Okay. Within the community itself, we're quite familiar with the evolutionary perspective on transitions as a long-term socio-technical system change. We're familiar with the interpretive perspective on transitions in terms of reflexivity and encouraging people to engage in second-order thinking. But contestation, while we're familiar with the perspective that contestation comes from, which is a structural perspective, it's about institutions. While we're familiar with that from a point of view of knowing about rules within a socio-technical system, we haven't really talked about what happens when rules conflict and how that can be managed. So that's where we're going to come from. That's what we're going to talk about today. Why this is important is that contestation is at the very core of what makes TIP experiments transformative. So while we may, without knowing too much about contestation, how you manage it, we may see this as a problem. We may see this as an issue to be avoided. However, contestation actually provides windows of opportunity for change. And if we can harness those windows of opportunity, then we can advance transitional goals. So the transition studies community has begun, the research community has begun to consider this problem of contestation relatively recently. So in 2020, or in 2020 rather, Frank Giels published a paper on what he called the MLP local model. The local model differs from the macro level or socio-technical system change we're all familiar with. And it's more about the negotiations, the interactions, the relationships that happen, that advance within TIP experiments, advance transition or translation goals. The mechanism that Giels refers to when he talks about why contestation emerges is a straight up neo-institutional or institutional logics approach. So essentially what that's about is that institutions provide sets of rules. These rules provide behavioral guidance for actors within the system. They don't dictate what an actor should do, but they tell an actor what they could potentially do from a legitimacy point of view, from what's congruent with a shared identity, and from a regulative mechanisms point of view, what are appropriate behaviors. As I say, they don't guide behavior. Sorry, they do guide behavior, but they're not dogmatic. They're not dictatorial. Actors can be embedded in multiple institutions, and because of that, they can experience conflicting goals or conflicting rules. Sorry, and I'm going to call a conflicting set of rule attention. So I want you to think about this as two poles, A and B. I can either do option A or option B of a particular tension. I, as an actor experiencing this tension, have what's called partial agency. So I can either adhere to the dominant rule and support an existing regime, or I can transgress. I can choose option B. If I do that, if enough people do that, or if powerful enough actors do that, we can start to see some destabilization of dominant rule sets. So in summary, the tensions that can happen or that can be experienced because of conflicting poles offer windows of opportunity for regime destabilization. The question for us then is, how can we harness what's called this generative potential of tensions? So To understand this, I'm going to draw on strategic management, some of the concepts that have emerged there over the last 20 years within a field that has been thinking about these as issues for quite some time. I'm going to start off with a definition of what attention is. Attention is a wide variety of dichotomies, dualities, conflicts, inconsistencies, and contradictory pulls or demands experienced by those in a particular setting and that appear to represent different and contradictory poles, and as such seem to require a choice of one or the other. Okay? So our rules are interacting, they're conflicting, we experience them as attention, A and B, and we believe we have to make a choice between one or the other. That's what we're talking about. But there are multiple types. I've published a blog post which gives a typology of different types. I'm going to focus on 3 here just for our purposes. First off is a trade-off, which is a zero-sum game where superior performance in one objective, A, is gained primarily by lowering performance in the other. So it's a straight, I do A and B goes down, or I choose the B and A goes down in terms of performance. A dialectic is a second type. This is a contradictory element, or thesis and antithesis A and B, which can be resolved through integration or a synthesis of C. And over time, that'll start to generate or confront new opposition, D. So we'll get our initial tension of A and B. We'll synthesize a way forward through that, which is option C. Over time, that'll experience something else, a more tension as a CD tension, and we'll be forced into choosing again within that. The third one I'll talk about is paradox. Paradox are contradictory yet interrelated elements that exist simultaneously and persist over time. And why paradoxes are interesting is because they underlie our most wicked societal problems. So where you've come across issues that seem intractable within your TIP contexts, underlying those may be some paradox. Okay, so that's what tensions are. We'll now talk about tension responses. And this is directly from where how strategic management thinks about this. Responses are important in terms of how we decide, how we devise strategies to respond to tensions. Again, from an organizational strategy perspective, the response we choose has a direct impact on organizational performance, particularly. And that's why this is important. So the paradox perspective, there's a lot of work has gone into that over the last 20 years. It's now become quite popular within academic conferences to talk about this, and is seeping into actual organizational strategies as well, particularly around sustainable development goals. Paradox theory says that there are 2 main approaches to how you can respond to tensions. There's a contingency approach and a paradox approach. Contingency approach is the basis of most organizational strategies. It involves using either or mindset, and the purpose is to achieve fit between your organizational internal elements and the external environment. The idea behind this is that if you achieve fit, that your internal elements can fit as much as possible to your external environments, that drives performance, that drives organizational performance. Okay. Within that mindset or within that approach, there are a number of different types of specific responses that you can have. So you can split the tension. You can separate contradictory elements in terms of temporality or spatially, in terms of having different structures to deal with different sides of things. You can regress. You can return to past understandings or actions where the tension is less salient and less noticeable. You can repress, you can deny or denial to block awareness of a tension and just carry on with one pole. You can use reaction formation, which is excessively focusing on one pole or and opposing the other. You can suppress, which is about dominating or overriding one pole while fostering the other. You can oppress, which is about asserting your own needs, knowing that that's going to cause a confrontation with other parties. Or you can project, which is about transferring tensions onto a scapegoat. Okay? So these are all responses that are very common within organizational strategy. And as I say, form the basis of most organizational strategies you may have come across. The issue happens, according to paradox theory, the issue comes in is that if your underlying problem, if your underlying tension is paradoxical in nature, if it's prolonged, and if you won't be able to solve it, you'll have to live it in some way. If that's the case, then a contingency approach won't work. It may drive short-term performance, but over the long term, you'll get what they call vicious reinforcing cycles. And it gives a couple of examples. So and these are very practice-based, so forgive the terminology. The theory refers to 3 vicious reinforcing cycles. It talks about rabbit holes, where actors become stuck in a rut, where strengths are overplayed or favored tension responses are overused, hindering learning and growth. So you tend to repeat what you've done before, what's proved successful before, even if it's not successful in the future. You may generate wrecking balls as another vicious reinforcing cycle. This is where you ping pong between competing poles of attention, because intense pressure from the neglected pole triggers an overcorrection. So literally you're swinging like a pendulum. Final one is trench warfare, which is polarization deepens ruts and escalates tension to antagonism. Okay? So if the contingency approach, if paradox theory says the contingency approach doesn't work for a paradoxical tension, what does work and what might work for us? The theory suggests using a both-and mindset. And if you can use a both-and mindset and frame the tension in a way that generates virtuous reinforcing cycles, then because the tension it prolongs over time, because it's not going to be solved, it's going to stay with you, then you can harness the generative potential of the paradox, perhaps indefinitely, or at least for very, very long times. And by harnessing that generative potential, you're essentially issuing an invitation to actors involved for creativity and for innovation. So it's an ongoing source of potential innovation to solve an issue. Types of responses that will be associated with a paradox approach. You can have acceptance. You can understand the contradiction, the tension, or the ambiguity as a natural condition of work. Confrontation involves critically discussing the tension to socially construct a more accommodating understanding. Transcendence involves reframing thinking to see elements of the paradox as necessary or complementary. And adjusting means addressing seeing both poles as important and needing to be achieved. If we harness that generative potential of the paradox, then the objective of that, the aim of us doing that, is to harness this virtuous reinforcing cycles. Again, the theory identifies 2 types. First of all, mules, which are creative win-win scenarios of both poles in harmony. And the second is tightrope walkers, which is a consistent inconsistency. It's essentially over very short periods of time, switching from focusing on one element or one pole of the tension to the other and back again, so that over time you're progressing on both sides. At this stage, we're going to go into plenary session. I understand unfortunately you're not seeing the full screen here, which is a bit of a problem. But I'd ask you at this point to turn on your microphones. So I'm going to start discussing a couple of things here. What we're interested in with this section is trying to identify the tensions you might yourself have come across within a TIP context, okay? because the transition studies literature has just started thinking about this conceptually, paradox hasn't broken through to a large extent to this community. And because of this, you do see evidence of various different types of tensions within some papers, for example, some academic papers that talk about tip contexts. But you're not seeing a typology anywhere. You're not seeing a collection of them brought together. You are seeing something like that within strategic management, as I say. So I'm going to go through a list of tensions that I've identified within papers that you may have come across. I'm going to use this to prompt some conversations in terms of, yes, I've seen this, or no, I haven't. So what I'd ask you to do is, as I go through my list, if you could just indicate in the affirmative that, yes, you see this happening, you've experienced it. If you'd like to share a story, absolutely fantastic. If not, don't worry about it. But I would like to get a sense here of what are the common tensions that you have come across within tip contexts. So I'm going to start. If you think of tensions as broken down into four main areas. So first, learning tensions, it's all about time. Second, organizing tensions, which is all about processes. Third, performing tensions, which is all about outcomes. And finally, belonging, which is all about identity. Okay, so four main types. They can overlap, so you can have mixtures of at least two types that you may experience. And I'll walk through a few different tensions, and as I say, just indicate whether you have seen these, whether these are issues for you within your tip experiences. Okay, so just a reminder, if you could now switch on your microphones, that'd be fantastic. So first tension, temporal depth. This is about decision-making time horizons over long versus short term. So this can be a tension, for example, within an organizational context. If you're responding to short time horizons, say, for example, to suit your quarterly reports, suit shareholder pressures, or if you're thinking more longer term in terms of strategic moves. Anybody seen any of those in tip contexts?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Excellent. Okay, that's good. If anybody would like to carry on and share a story, that'd be absolutely fantastic in terms of how did this play out? How did you experience it? How did you manage it? And was it successful in managing? That'd be fantastic.
My first thought when I saw this temporal depth tension was related to the tension between a process such as a formative evaluation one and more control based type of evaluation processes, and there are organizations or people within organizations participating in my case in the shared agendas that are conflicted by this by these two approaches, and they feel overwhelmed in terms of the overload of work that this can imply.
Mary, thanks for sharing that, first of all, Mary. It's interesting you mentioned overwhelmed, which would indicate that, yeah, there could be an underlying paradox there. Just a matter of interest, how did you go about managing this? And was that successful?
First of all, listening to those people speaking about that, and being understanding about the type of tensions people may experience, but we haven't managed that directly from the TIPSY team, because it is not in our hands to manage it. At the end of the day, it's a question of how the process is being held or managed by those organizations that are in charge of it. So we we explain and we acknowledge this type of tensions, and we kind of we put value in the different outcomes that following a strategy such an evaluation, a formative evaluation one can bring to the whole process.
Okay, very interesting. So I'm going to move on to the next tension. You get the idea of what this plenary will involve in terms of just trying to bring some of these experiences to the fore, so we can surface these as issues and see if if this approach might actually make sense or be useful in a TIP context. So the second type of temporal tension is temporal speed. This is about fast versus slow decision making. Okay. Where this can be an issue is that you may feel some degree of urgency to respond to a particular issue. The downside of that is that you may not fully understand what the issue actually is, particularly for more wicked problems. You may not have time to bring a lot of stakeholders on board to get different perspectives. So you may feel yourself forced into to quick action, but the downside of that is that you may act in a way that may not provide an effective solution. So again, throwing that open to the crowd. Have you come across this as an issue within TIP contexts?
I can jump in here. Hi, Len. Thanks. Sorry, my camera's off. I'm having to multitask a little bit.
No,
cooking whilst listening. Yeah, I've just finished a report with a I guess what might be seen as a TIP flavored consortium in the Netherlands. It was looking at water usage, of course, in the Netherlands, and a group was a sort of a consortium was brought together of different disciplines of scientists and also some practice partners from sort of civil society and other groups, and they came together in a defined time period to try and find solutions that for this kind of cooperative water management thing. And after a year, they hadn't found any, basically, and so all of the private sector partners that were only there on the basis of the business case left, because they were like, this is a waste of time. We're just joining these workshops, like we can't find anything. None of the outputs here are actually useful for my day-to-day concerns as an entrepreneur running my huge tomato greenhouse that needs surface water, whatever it was. And so it was only then all of the sort of the business people had left, and then for the next year, the other people stayed and actually ended up finding really useful solutions, which then couldn't be implemented because the sort of consortium of people that provided that implementation context had already gone. So it was like this sense of the private sector parties really needing something hard and fast now to justify their involvement, whereas other parties sort of perhaps being more used to the slowness of finding good solutions and working through, dare I say, tensions. So yeah, that's what sprung to mind. Really.
Okay, that's interesting. Just a matter of interest, when the your partners withdrew, was there any chance of getting them back, or did you manage to get them back in any way?
So I was actually brought in as a sort of ex post evaluator of said project. So I was
okay, gotcha.
Years after they'd left, actually a couple of years after they'd left. So I do know that there were, I think, probably underlying tensions which probably contributed to that, but they didn't. In the end, it seemed come back.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for that. Next one, we'll talk about collaborative process challenges. So again, this is directly from a specific paper. Finding common ground on goals and approach within collaborative governance efforts.
Yes, I think I can add something here. Sophia Avdechikova, Lund University.
Hi, Sophia.
So I'm working on a paper now looking at how regions integrate transformative innovation ambitions in their innovation policy. And I'm not sure it's about this really, but you mentioned goal setting. So I thought I could mention this example, because the issue really is that the regions are supposed to have their own innovation policies that are to contribute to regional growth. And they are also supposed to have policies that are to contribute to sustainable development. And no one can really understand whether the growth should be achieved through sustainable development, whether they should achieve growth and sustainable development through different approaches, and or whether someone has now, or whether the growth goal is no longer relevant, and in that case, who made that decision, and how does this affect a bunch of other things that they're supposed to do. So in terms of finding the common ground, yeah, it's very unclear from different governance documents in terms of what they're actually supposed to do and how this all goes together.
Great. How are you managing that? I mean, you mentioned it's quite difficult. Do you have a specific approach, or are you just trying to find some progress wherever you can?
Yeah, I'm trying to follow a number of regions who are trying to manage this, I think, and they are. I think there are two approaches to that, and which it goes back to your previous slide. There is a team who separates between this, and they say that we want to achieve competitiveness and sustainable development as two very different things. Yeah, and they have people working on competitiveness, and they have people working in sustainable development. And when you ask them, well, is this how they're supposed to get done? They say, well, then someone come tell us otherwise. And then there are others who say, well, let's find the areas where we can grow through sustainability. But their approaches seem to be very long-term, very theoretical, and they have harder time mobilizing stakeholders because there are. It's not really clear how they're going to resolve all the interests and still end up with growth and sustainability on the other side.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thanks very much, Sophia. Next one, mission innovation tensions. So this is a Mariana Mazzucato paper for those people who know her work. Setting mission goals through planning versus through having a freedom to experiment. So top down versus bottom up, basically. No takers? Okay. Substantive problem-solving challenges, identifying a specific wicked problem versus defining the problem and its root causes during collaborative governance. That sounds a little bit like what you've seen, actually, Sophia, just in terms of knowing that wicked problems can be difficult to define by their very nature, and because they're conflicted and uncertain. Then you may have that issue may be there.
Yeah, I think this very much also fits into this because I mean the way you develop solutions, it depends on how you define the problem, and if there are only a certain set of solutions that are possible in this case, where you can actually combine the growth ambitions and sustainable development ambitions, this go back to how you define your problem, of course.
Okay. That's great. Multi-relational accountability challenges. So this is where you may be involved in a tip experiment, for example, and you may set up some type of mechanism to evaluate the success of that experiment. So there may be a new accountability. Sorry, you may set up a new accountability channel then, just to make sure that what you're doing ticks the boxes with whoever you're reporting to. That may be in conflict with more established, generally organizational accounting channels. So it's a tension between different accounting channels that you may need to report to. No, you may come across that with multi-actor collaborative governance, particularly where you do have different people needing to report back with progress. I realize we're kind of moving on time, so I won't do an awful lot more of these, but I will do a couple more. For the researchers involved in the audience today, there's a couple of things that happen at an individual level, which I thought were quite interesting. So there's a role identity paradox, which is the role identity of sustainability researchers and a conflict between the researcher as affecting change versus studying change. Anybody notice that as a difficulty?
Yes. Just to say that this has come up in several of the experiments that Tipley's worked on, in terms of the identity of researchers and how they define themselves. Yeah.
Any management tips or strategies that you've used or have been used that you've encountered?
I think people who've been involved in that have talked about the need to find common ground and to develop a shared language and shared understanding, so that you're kind of bridging that gap rather than having a binary, you're one or the other. And the term of pracademic, I've heard that maybe there's a different way of interpreting how researchers are working together with practitioners.
Okay, great.
I can add something to this as well. I'm sorry, Ellen. In Sweden, we are starting now a collaboration platform between researchers from a number of universities and governmental agencies on addressing a number of challenges with transformative innovation policy. And we have been very upfront that we will be involved and we will provide advice, and it will affect the implementation. So it will probably be better results and probably be a bit less publishable research work, as many journals don't really appreciate that. But we have been upfront with this, and this is a trade-off that we have made for ourselves, and we are very much aware of that.
Okay, great. I'll do two more.
Sorry, Len, can I just interrupt to say that I think Vipash,
Yeah.
you might have an example as well. I've just noticed you put that in the chat. You might not have seen.
Ah, yes.
No, I just wanted to just chip in with a nod that is definitely a dilemma as a researcher. But I think that's also part of the training of a transdisciplinary researcher. I think that's where the generative element that you come in. So the kind of both and both.
Mm.
So we don't try to sort of see this as a tension necessarily, but rather something that is generative and window of opportunity. That's really nice.
Thanks for that, Vipashi. It's an interesting point that you've raised there in terms of not seeing it as a tension. Remember that tensions can be creative. So while we may automatically think of tensions negatively, and quite naturally we do, that's not necessarily the case. Okay.
Yeah, good.
So two more, and then we'll move on, because I realize time is escaping us. I thought wicked problem evaluation paradox was an interesting one. So this is evaluating policy efforts to tackle wicked problems specifically, knowing that by definition wicked problems are open-ended. So it's where you stop, where you draw the line when you're dealing with a wicked problem. Anybody see anything along those lines?
Yeah, I can. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, Karin, go ahead. It's fine. I have already spoken.
Okay. I'm not sure where exactly this fits in, but in the food and agriculture sector, I've done work with standards and policies around local and sustainable standards for institution, retail, and everything. And there's just this wide open field of organic to regenerative agriculture to private sector standards that are coming in, and everybody's sort of in competition, and it is a wicked problem because we all want to get to sustainability, but we have different ways of doing it and different ways of tackling the different problems. So it's not that it's been completely documented as a whole sector problem, but it is just, that challenge using those policy mechanisms to regulate, if you say, and educate consumers. And mine is a Canadian, North American perspective, but if you look at the choices in Canada of the eggs you can buy, from cage-free to free range to organic to omega, you can see the depth of the problem in sustainability standards for the food and ag sector.
Great, Karen. Thanks very much for that. Vipashi, did you want to come in on your what you've seen?
No, just wanted to acknowledge that indeed this is a problem especially in framing, what problem are we? What's the impact of system change? I think that's what we have always tried to sort of see. Okay, there is a goal, but we want to do system change, and we have our outcomes, transformative outcomes. But what's the kind of next step? So we have also tried to sort of develop indicators, try to see what are the kind of things that we are achieving by transformative outcomes, the kind of performative aspect of it. But it's indeed quite difficult to define that.
Okay. Okay, great. So I think from this session, this plenary session at least, we've established that these things are there. They're ubiquitous, I think, within TIP contexts, which is what we would expect. They're ubiquitous with any type of organizational efforts towards achieving some type of shared goals. So it's not surprising that they are there. So the next question is, what can we do about them? What kind of approach can we use? And particularly, does the paradox approach, is there any evidence that it might work in these type of situations? So bear in mind that paradox hasn't broken in to a large degree into transitional studies yet, but there are a couple of papers that I was able to identify which use the paradoxical management approach for some of these tensions and reported some success. So just to read through a couple, Wardenberg from 2020 reports collaborative multi-agency governance efforts suffered paradox associated with substantive problem-solving challenges, collaborative process challenges, and multi-relational accountability challenges, a couple of the ones we mentioned earlier on. They found that adopting a both-and mindset transcended the paradox, enabling progress to be made. So there is some evidence that it worked in those type of situations. Focusing more on the individual ones, experienced by sustainability scientists. Scientists operating between the public science and commercial research adopted a both-and mindset to deal with paradoxes of role identity, professional integrity, and service ethos. So again, using that both-and mindset to internally find some type of way forward when you're meeting these challenges. And finally, this is more of from industry rather than a policy context, but I thought it was interesting from a sustainability point of view. Oil firms that juxtapose the short-term and long-term also confronted business society tensions and were more likely to recognize the complexity of climate change and the need for integrated multidimensional solutions. So it does seem to activate second-order learning as well, which is quite interesting. So I think the evidence is quite scant at the moment in terms of whether this approach specifically is suited to a TIP context, but there are indications that A, as we've seen today, these tensions do occur. B, that there are a couple of papers out there showing that, yeah, the approach might actually be suitable. So we've got about 13 minutes left, and I want to do some questions as well. So I'm going to scoot right to the very end of this. And I realized you can't see the slides again, which is unfortunate. But in the blog piece that I've written, that I think Vicky has sent out a link to, I describe some of the things that I'm just going to finish with here. There are a number of tools and practical approaches to how you go about dealing with tensions. Specifically, there's one that was only published last year by the seminal authors within the paradox theory field, called the Paradox System. So this is a practitioner-oriented book designed with a set of tools about how you actually go about managing tensions. And I'm going to make a pitch for it to be part of the resource lab, because I think it suits, or it fits in quite well with some of the tools that are in there already. Essentially, it's a set of tools that are broken down into maybe 4 different elements. One, enabling the dynamics to unleash tensions, which will include setting up measured experimentation, very, very tip-oriented, preparing for serendipity, and learning to unlearn, which is, again, thinking about transformative outcomes. I think that works quite well. A second element of the 4 elements of this, shifting to both and assumptions. This would involve things like accepting multiple truths, framing resources as abundant, using problem solving as coping, surfacing the underlying paradox within any tension, and trying to personalize the paradox by connecting competing demands with individual actors' goals, so making it a bit more personal. Establishing boundaries, so linking to a higher purpose, building guardrails so that you don't go too far, separating and connecting, and diversifying the stakeholders we talk to. And finally, which is an interesting one, which I don't think we've dug into an awful lot within the TIP context yet, finding comfort within discomfort. So a couple of tools to become more, to have discomfort more acceptable or accepted, building in pauses to avoid knee-jerk reactions, and mechanisms to broaden perspectives. So quite an interesting approach for anybody who wants to play in the space of managing or responding to tensions with a paradoxical approach. That's a fairly good starting point. And I'm going to draw a halt at this stage and use the remaining 5-10 minutes or so just for any reflections, any questions we may have at this stage. I'm just going to, well, I'll leave the screen shared for a second, just in case anybody does want to refer back to anything.
Maybe if you go back to the second slide, pivot point 2.
And Len, I'm not sure if you can see, I think we might have a question from Anna.
Yes, I see Anna's hand. This slide? Karen?
No, sorry, the tension, the pivot point 2, the one before the one you just finished with. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Let Anna go ahead.
Yeah, I think my question, I work in a circular economy context. So looking into how policy labs and entrepreneurship programs can actually enable circular economy at a national level. And I think the biggest question marks or tensions we face are often working across system levels. So it's moving between sort of the meso level of a specific industry, the macro level of the whole national economy, and the very micro level of interests involved from various actors. And I was wondering where in your framework and what you have just presented this comes in, and how you sort of would address that type of level movement.
So this sorry, just to get it clear in my mind, this is a system level, but it's between levels within the system. Is that correct?
Well, I think ultimately we hope for impact on a national level, which is of course quite ambitious, and it would be your macro level if you wish so. Mm-hmm. But of course, as we do experimentation, we start somewhere on a like way below, and we delineate the system.
So that's an interesting one. Is that a tension, or is that an evaluation issue?
No, I think it's really an action issue, because it's a matter of on which level do we have to act to achieve impact, and on which level do we start, and how do we scale from maybe a small policy lab into higher levels.
Interesting. Okay. So again, with the nature of the tension, do you think this is paradoxical in nature? Is it prolonged? Does it go on over time?
Yes.
Okay, so potentially paradoxical, which is interesting. So that would suggest then one of the two types of virtuous reinforcing cycles that that the approach would recommend would be either a consistent inconsistency, so focusing on one level first of all, then the other, then back again, and so on and so forth. To essentially, the idea is to progress overall over a pace of time, but while switching focus. Okay. The other approach then is the mule, I think they called it, which was about trying to identify, and I'm not too sure this would be possible in this situation, trying to identify, is there some type of creative win-win scenario where you can advance both at the same time.
Yeah, it's the ideal scenario, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
But okay. Yeah, thank you.
No problem. Any other questions?
Can I? Yeah, thank you very much, Len. This is really, really interesting and very relevant, because we have always known there are tensions, and I personally have gained a lot from this presentation and also from your blog. So very much, really, really appreciated. I just wanted to maybe raise a question. I don't know whether I mean, this is not something I need a quick answer to, but the role of narrative, to what extent tensions or paradoxes are discursive, in the sense that, like, when we talk about accelerating transition, and its sort of contradiction or tension with justice or just transition, how would you see that? Would you see that as a tension, or would you say this is, narrative driven, or
So-
how to sort of respond to that perceived tension between justice and acceleration?
So within an institutional or an institutional logic's perspective, they'd see narratives as a carrier for institutions. So the narrative will have certain institutional rules embedded within it. And then when different actors come along, say with different narratives, different institutional logics or different rules will interact at that point. You have a conflict between narratives, and hence your tension will surface. You will experience your tension at that stage. So that the narrative itself isn't the tension, that the competing narratives will be the tension. We've seen some literature on framing contests, for example, that come into play there, which isn't directly related to paradox. But you in terms of, again, paradox approaches, where the underlying tension is paradoxical, and I would guess that you will come across that with narratives, because narratives are more system level and can be invoked by various different actors within various different contexts. So there will be more of a system level tension involved there. It will be difficult to shift that, but you may be able to shift it within say experimental spaces. And there is some research. There is a paper that I do remember, where just by having a shared space that people can interact and negotiate and discuss each other's narratives and try to get common perspective on it, that has in the past, in certain circumstances, allowed people to progress. So that's quite interesting context. Okay, I think we're more or less done. We've got about 2 minutes left. Anybody else want to raise anything, or will I hand back over to Vicky at this stage?
I had one question.
Ollie, sorry.
This is a good timing. Yeah, really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much. I've just started doing a literature review on kind of drawing on a similar approach, actually, tensions, and presenting some of the early findings to some of the stakeholders we've been working with on this project. Even presenting them as tensions, and we've also taken the approach that tensions are sort of somewhat inevitable and generative and an opportunity for creativity. I wonder if you have any insights on how to sort of actually leverage this kind of vocabulary and way of seeing things when you're dealing with the people involved. We got a little bit of pushback when we were sort of saying, well, we've spotted some tensions here, and a lot of the people in the room, especially from the public sector, were kind of like, there's no tensions here, everything's fine. There was the sort of using that language suggested they had problems, and they were very sure that they didn't. So yeah, how do you use this in a way that sort of lands with people, if that makes sense?
The best approach is the slide that you can see part of at the moment. The paradox system, I think, is a useful way of looking at this. The issue that you mentioned, I've come across numerous times. I've been researching tensions for a couple of years, or for a number of years now. And because the vocabulary isn't out there to a large extent, people use different types of tensions interchangeably to a large extent. And tension itself, as we were talking about earlier, tends to be viewed negatively, and can be taken, as you've mentioned in this context, can be taken negatively by managers, particularly as an issue, a managerial issue within their particular organization, for example. So yeah, you may get a bit of denial going on. I have found, though, that once you start talking to people about what examples of tensions might look like, you start to change the narrative a little bit, and that people can start to identify, actually, yeah, that's happening here. That's happening, I can see this happening, and I can see, ideally, I could see this potentially as an issue that I might need to do something about as a manager, for example. So it's just about education, I would suggest, at this stage, and bringing people through what some of these terms are, what they might mean, and what they might mean in specific contexts that people are experiencing.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll hand back to Vicky. So thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Len. That's been such an interesting session. And I think interesting to finish on that last question, because the takeaway for me has been about just the framing of it can be very helpful in itself, to rather than see these as barriers to transformation, to see the generative potential of when we come up against contestation. So it's been really, really interesting. Thank you. And I hope that we'll be able to continue to explore this area through other engagements with the knowledge community and with the resource lab. And we've got a few things in the chat with just people saying thank you very much, and how, various things that have been interesting about the presentation. So a big thanks to Len. And before we leave, I also wanted to flag up for people who are in the session today that we have another session next week on Thursday, because Len touched a little bit on the resource lab today, the Transformative Innovation Policy resource lab. And next week, we have a session where we're focusing on a particular tool within the resource lab, which is looking at system mapping, the pentagonal map for system analysis. And we have Manuel Laranja visiting us with Rob Byrne from the SPRU at the University of Sussex, and they'll be talking together about some core transitions concepts. So hopefully some of you will be able to rejoin for that session as well. So thanks very much, Len. Round of virtual applause, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thanks very much, and thank you, everybody.